Okay, so today we are talking about error handling and debugging. So we got this file product.list.xlsm to download, so go ahead and get that file open. And all it is, we're going to use this file for several days of examples, but it's just product information. So it's was from some online outdoor product store that's now long out of business since I swiped their data in the early 2000s. But so products are in a department, they have a manufacturer, some description of what it is, what the price is, and so forth. So this is just the data that we have that we're going to be working on. Now, ultimately, where we're headed with this data is we're going to use this as the data for our user forms. What's a user form? We'll get into it specifically. We've got a couple of days we're talking about user forms, but it's where we make another window pop up, not a worksheet, but another window that we can control. We can put buttons on it, and we can put text in various places and drop-down lists and so forth. And so this is the data that we're going to use for that. One of the things we'll want to do is kind of give us a way to be able to choose which department there is. There's like only 4 or 5 different departments here. So as we're entering in information for a new product, I want to be able to pick off of a list what the departments are. The trouble is we don't really have a master list of departments. All we have is the data that's in the department column. And so the task that I would like to pursue today is to be able to create a sub-procedure that allows us to select one of those columns of data and have it build for us a new sheet that just has the unique values from that column. And maybe not always build a new sheet, but if the sheet already exists, we'll have it just add a new kind of lookup list. I want to be able to easily generate the lookup list for this set of data. So that's the goal. That's the background that we're going to be using for working with error handling and debugging today. So let's dig in. Alt F11. By the way, on the midterm exam, I noticed today as I was reviewing it, there's a little bit on keystrokes, and that might be one to remember. That whole Alt F11 to open up your code. All right. So I've got one module here. It's called Module 1, and I'm going to make a sub-procedure. I'm going to call this sub-procedure, what should we call it? Make list. So what I'd like to do is be able to run this and have it somehow specify the name of the sheet. Maybe we'll pass in a few parameters here. So I'm going to send it a sheet name as a string. Let me also send in list name as a string. And let me give it a column as a range. Thank you. Get that string spelled correctly. So here's the idea. We're going to say we want to make this list on some sheet. Now, if that sheet exists, great. We want to work with that sheet. If the sheet doesn't exist, we want to go ahead and create that worksheet. Then in the top column of the cell that we're building the list, or the column we're building the list, and we want to put the name of the list. We're passing in the list name, and then we also want to have some columns. So we're going to give a reference to the column that we want to use to pull the data in. All right. So step 1 then is going to be to try to make that sheet. So pretty easy. Let's go ahead and dim a variable to hold the sheet. Let me just call it S. Dim S as a worksheet. Now let's set S equal to the set of all the worksheets, the one identified by the name the user passed in. All right. Now, sheet name, thank you. Now, okay, so just to get the feeling for where you are as far as coming along with me, when you look at that line, how many of you go, I totally understand everything about that line, this line, the most recently typed line? How many of you are going, there's something about that I don't understand, and I'm ready to tell you what it is I don't understand? Got it. Okay, go ahead.
Just don't have any little what's the difference them down there or one up there?
Okay, so let's talk about these variables that I've declared up here on the line where I'm declaring the sub-procedure. These are a special kind of variable called a parameter. This means that, and these are variables, very good. These are variables just like the variable that I've declared here. What's the difference? The big difference is that when I've declared variables up here and made them parameters, they get their value when this sub-procedure is called. And so I cannot just run this like a regular macro because a regular macro has to be ready to run. And this thing says, hey, before I can run, I got to know values for all three of these variables, all three of these parameters. And so to run this, let me just make another sub-procedure that I can use to run this. I'll call this my Acme sub runner. And so to be a valid call for this sub-procedure, I have to have the name of the sub-procedure followed by the arguments, the values that I want to assign to these variables. And so sheet name, why don't we call the sheet name lists? Be just a sheet to hold our various lists. The list name. So this one, let's do this. What was it? Was it department? It has just a few. Yeah. So I've got this here, department. So that will be the header that I want on there. And then I'm going to give it a range. So this is the column that I'm reading the data from. And so this is going to be range. Let's go ahead and talk about the sheet. So sheets, this is the products sheet. Dot columns, column number 3. That's column C. So I'm telling it which column to work with. I'm telling it what I want to name the list. And I'm telling it which sheet that I want to put this on. Okay, so now, by the time this runs, these three variables will be declared and they will have their values already. What's the value of sheet name going to be when I run my Acme sub runner? Yeah, the value of this variable will be lists. The value of list name will be department, and the column range will be bound onto this range. Got it? Okay, other questions on what we have so far? Go ahead. Oh, so the question is, could I have one be a worksheet instead of calling it a string? If I here for lists, yeah. So yeah, I could pass a reference to a worksheet here, but what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to say, listen, I want this sheet. If it exists, I want to use it. If it doesn't exist, I want to create it. And so if this were a reference to a worksheet, the worksheet would already have to exist. And that's part of what I want to deal with today is to say, well, we're going to say use the worksheet if it exists, otherwise create it. And it's partly because it's a pretty simple example to look at error handling. Okay. So but you're right. Yeah, we could make it a worksheet object and then just pass a reference to that particular sheet. Good. Okay. Other questions? What's the benefit of setting it up this way? Meaning using the parameters here? So the big benefit about having these as parameters instead of just variables that are defined in here with their values is that I could call this multiple times. Once I've created the sub-procedure, I'd like to be able to call it multiple times. So I'll have lists, maybe I want to make a list of manufacturers. How about just man? And then I would tell this here it's column 4. And so, yeah, the idea is I want to be able to just do exactly the same thing except for these few little things, and then I can just send that in when I call the procedure. And I don't have to change the code. That's the big reason for having parameters, is saying this stuff is going to be different each time I run it, so specify it with the call. Okay, other questions? All right. We'll probably run both of those, but for now, let's just go ahead and make one call. Okay, why did I call this the Acme sub runner? And the answer is I want it to be something that starts alphabetically low so that when I'm working down here and I press F5 to run this, it'll say, hey, you can't run the one that you're on because it takes parameters, but I want this to be alphabetically sorted the first one, so just kind of while I'm debugging here, so I can just hit enter, hit F5, and when that pops up, go, oh yeah, I just hit enter and run it. Does that make sense? I'm just making this, I'm trying to name this with some name, so it will be at the top of my list, just as we're running here. Okay, so if I run this, let's go ahead and run it. So I'm trying to bind my variable onto the worksheet now. What worksheets do I have here? I have one called promos. I have one called products. Do I have anything else there? I don't think so, just those two. So what's going to happen when I run this? It's going to get subscript out of range. I get an error here. I'll say debug, and right here, what does that mean, subscript out of range? It's actually kind of a bad error. There's really no subscript here. But what's the error mean? Why do I have this error? Go ahead. Yeah, there's no worksheet called lists. I said, listen, look at your whole collection of worksheets, find the one named lists, and bind this variable onto it. Well, there is no worksheet named lists, and so that's an error. So that's the trouble here. In fact, let me run it again, and it should tell me this is error number 9. We've seen some pretty high errors, like in the thousands. But this one, error number 9. It's an early error. Subscript out of range. Why is it called a subscript? By the way, what's a subscript? If I was just to say this, whoops, Control Z. Let me come up here to my immediate window, and I'm just going to print worksheets sub1 dot name. That one is a subscript. It's a number that identifies an element in a set. That's technically what a subscript is. Now, I guess, kind of back in the early days of BASIC, we didn't identify things by their name. We identified them by their number. There's no named collections. And so we had this error. Runtime number 9 was invented in the 1970s. It's been around a long time. And so when we had an error where we're trying to do this, we're saying, well, that's kind of the same thing. You're trying to identify an item in a collection, and even though it really isn't a subscript, we're saying that's still runtime error number 9. It's a name that doesn't exist. That's how it ends up with. That's the origin of that description. Okay, there's a couple things we could do here. There is no way to just easily ask, does this worksheet exist? Does a worksheet by this name exist? We could write a function that does that. What would that look like? What would we have to do to be able to answer that question, does a worksheet by this name exist? Just kind of give me a thumbnail sketch of what you might do in English. Don't worry about VBA, just give me an algorithm in English. What would it be? Any thoughts? What would you have to do to tell me if a worksheet by that name exists? There's no built-in way to do it. John? Yeah, just make a loop that goes through all the worksheets and compare the name that we're looking for to the name of the first sheet. Nope. Name of the sheet. Nope. Doesn't match. And that could then return true or false without having an error. And so we could do that. But since we're trying to talk about handling errors, I want to show that. So I'm going to show you a different approach to that. Now, generally speaking, there's 3 categories of errors we can make while we're programming. The first one is called a syntax error. Let's just take a look at a syntax error. I leave that parenthesis off, and I get a syntax error. It tells me, the interpreter says, I have no idea what you're talking about. This is syntactically invalid. There's some rules that you have to follow if you're going to write a statement and you haven't followed the rules. So, interesting question. Anytime I make a syntax error, is the line necessarily going to turn red? Or could I have a syntax error where there's where the line doesn't turn red? What do you think? Yes, what?
Like if you took the N off sheet name, it wouldn't give you an error, but you don't have a variable.
Okay. So the comment here is, if we take this E off, or maybe you said the N, but so now I have a variable that's not spelled correctly and says maybe this is a syntax error. This is a different kind of error. Syntactically, this is okay. We are following the rules here. So the rule is here, we're going to bind an object variable onto an object. So we use the keyword set. We put the name of the object. We have an equal sign. We put in the collection. And then we have to have some string here. Well, this is just a variable. And so syntactically, it's okay. That's potentially a valid variable name. The syntax is beautiful here. So this is a different kind of error. We can kind of force this to be a syntax error or something the compiler at least would catch because we have option explicit here. So we try to run this now, it'll say, there's a problem here. But syntactically, we're okay here. It's a valid token name, even though the token doesn't exist. There was another comment here on how we might have a syntax error that doesn't have a red line. Any thoughts? Here's how you can have a syntax error that the editor doesn't know about, that there's no line to make red. So let's suppose I said this. If s.name equals something, list, then we'll do some stuff, and then I don't put an and if. Syntactically, is this valid? No, this is invalid syntax. So listen, if I have a block if statement, and that means I've got an if then with nothing else out here, there's nothing out here, so it's not a single line if statement, it's a block if, I've got to have an and if. But because the line is just missing, there's nothing to paint red. And so it can still be invalid syntax. Okay. So syntax error is an error that the compiler can identify. You try to compile the code. You try to turn this VBA into machine code so it can be executed, and it says, I can't do it. So syntax errors just have to get rid of. Second kind of error is the one we'll be dealing with in this next little segment. It's called a runtime error. What's the difference? Runtime error, the syntax looks beautiful. I mean, everything is right about it, but when we go to execute it, it can't accomplish the thing that we're telling it to execute. That's what we've set up for here. Let me get rid of this statement here. But that's what we've set up here. So we're going to be passing in lists into the sheet name variable. We're going to try to bind on to a worksheet named list. Syntactically, that's beautiful. It's a valid string. Everything is done properly. But when the interpreter actually tries to do it, the interpreter is capable of translating that into an instruction to do, but when we try to do the instruction fails. That's a runtime error because the error doesn't happen until we're running, until the time when we're running the program. So it's a runtime error. Runtime errors, we have two things. First thing we like to do with runtime errors, we like to get rid of them. So we just like to say, you know what, let's just get rid of it. Second thing we can do, instead of getting rid of it, is to trap it. Is to say, let's tell the interpreter, see, the interpreter, it doesn't really care what it does as long as it has something to do. It's when you tell it to do something that's impossible that it starts to complain. And so essentially what we're going to do with an error trap is we're going to say, listen, interpreter, starting from this point on, if you run into something you can't do, we'll tell you how to handle it. We'll tell you, go do something else. Or we might say, just forget it and move on. We'll tell it how to behave if it gets to something that it can accomplish. That's what an error trap is. And then the interpreter is happy again. It says, oh, I couldn't do that, but I know what else I can do. I've got something else to do. Without an error trap, you get to a line that it can't accomplish, and it goes, yeah, I can't do that, I'm done. It just stops. And the whole idea of an error trap is to say, listen, if you get to something you can't do, I'll tell you what to do instead. That's it. And that's what because that interpreter just wants to run code. And as long as it's got something to do, it's happy. We're going to try to keep it happy. So that's a second kind of error. That's called a runtime error. We're going to see how to trap those today. Third kind of error is called a logic error. Logic error is where you say syntactically it's right. It can compile to machine code instruction and execute, that's right, but it doesn't do what I thought it was supposed to do. These are the ones that, we got to track them down, and they're hard to find. These can sometimes be very hard to track down. And so to find those kinds of errors and deal with those are where we have various debugging tools that we'll also talk about today. So it's really about dealing with errors today. Okay, let's look at a basic error trap. So what we're going to do is we're going to come somewhere in the code before the suspect line. Here's a line that we think this might fail. And so sometime before this, we're going to set up the trap, and here's how we do it. We say on error. That's the syntax that says, okay, compiler, from this point on, if you see an error, and then we tell it what to do. Now, the chapter on this talks about kind of several different ways to do this. We're going to spend our time mostly on one technique that I find is the most useful. But we may have time to show at least introduce you to some of the others. They're all very similar to each other. So here we go. On error, I'm going to say resume next. On error, R-E-S-U-M-E, next. This instruction says, from this point to the rest of the sub-procedure, if you run into a line that you can't execute, skip it and move on. This is a really dangerous thing to do just by itself. You get to a line, I don't know why it failed. We won't know why it failed. It just failed. It must not have been important anyway. Just keep on going. You leave this line in just by itself right here, you'll never see another. You have just converted all of your runtime errors into logic errors. it'll never interrupt you, and your code won't do what you want it to do at all. And that's going to be pretty tough to track down. So this is not the end here. That's what we're saying. Listen, if you get to a line you can't run, beautiful. Just keep on. Just don't try anymore and move on. And so I've done that immediately before the line that I think is suspect. This is one that I think I have a pretty good feeling for what's going to happen here. So now, right after the line, the block of code that I think is suspect, I'm going to say this. If, and now there's another object we haven't dealt with. It's called ERR. So there's an error object. ERR dot number. Remember when we ran that code, what error number did it give us? Runtime error number 9. And that means subscript out of range. You try to refer, in this context, you try to refer to a worksheet that doesn't exist. And so now, if it tries to do that, it will still set that error. I will be able to know which error number happened. I'm not going to show it to the user. Instead, I'm going to ask, hey, was that runtime error number 9? If error number equals 9, then I got a pretty good idea what's going on here. Else, if error.number equals 0, what do you think error number 0 is? Error number 9 is subscript out of range. Error number like 1 is well, another really low one is overflow. There's a couple, basic ones. But what about error number 0? No error. Yeah, error number 0 is there's no error. Everything worked fine. And so in this case, let's see, put a then for this one. There was no error. Up here, we will say, what was it? Subscript out of range. Subscript out of range. Okay, those are the two things that if that's the condition of my error object after I run this line of code, I got a pretty good idea what happened. Now, is that the only two possible things there could be? I don't know. I can't think of anything else, but you know what? It's always a good idea to kind of anticipate there could be something else. And so here I'm going to say else, and if, here I'll say, some other error. For right now, I'm just going to put a stop here. Probably don't want to leave stop in your code, but when I'm debugging, I'm not anticipating hitting that. If I ever hit that, I would really like to see where did that problem happen. And so that will just say, here's where the problem happened. All right. So let's suppose we get to this point. We passed it in lists. The sheet now doesn't exist. What should we do? What's the right way to behave if that sheet doesn't exist? Yeah, just make the sheet. It doesn't exist. Let's go ahead and make it. So in this case, let's just say set s equal to worksheets.add. So now we'll have a new worksheet. Wonderful. We're going to name it. s.name equals what? Sheet name. S-A-T-E-T name. So now, when I get through this code, feeling pretty good about it. Now, regardless of whether I had the error or didn't have the error, at this point, it's going to be, we're going to have the sheet. But we do something else here too. Let's go ahead. If it's a brand new sheet, we know where we're going to build this list. And so let's go ahead and I'd like to put the name of the list in the top row. I'm trying to think of the sequence of this that I want to do. We're going to name it at some point, but let's skip the name for now. Okay. Now we're going to have to do something here if we end up, with one that already exists. But let's go ahead and kind of run it through the first time. So at this point, by the time we get through here, we're kind of done handling that error. So let's go ahead and come right here and say, we're now going to give it an instruction that says, I've now done everything I think I should do to handle that error. And so I need to tell it, if an error happens from now on, it's not what I'm anticipating. Better show me the normal error handler. This one I probably should write the comment first because the code is really weird. Return to normal error handling is what we're about to do. On error, go to 0. Whoa, it's a really weird syntax. Back in the very early days of BASIC, it was terrible. You had to number your lines. You like say, while you're writing a line of BASIC, you said, this is line number 1. 1. You put the number 1 there, and then you'd write the statement. And then the next line, you'd put 2, and you'd write the statement. And the whole reason you did that is because the way that you made a sub procedure was you would just say, you know what, just branch down to line 10,000. And then it would just jump down to line number 10,000, execute whatever code you had there, and you would have a return statement down there that would send it back up to wherever the last branch came from. It was really, really ugly. Well, what happened if you wrote line number 1 and line number 2, and then you decide you want to put something between those two lines? You had to renumber every line number that came out. It was hideous. You had whole programs just to renumber your code and everything. It was a nightmare. The point was, back in those days, the very lowest legal line number was what? Can you guess what it was? It's 1. And so when we tell it on error go to 0, it's a line number. Go to line number 0, we're telling it to do something that's impossible. And so that's the way that we signal to it, oh, just go back to your normal error handling. This is a statement that you have to say, that's really weird, I just have to memorize it. Yeah, that statement says return to default normal error handling. In other words, if we have a runtime error after this line executes, stop the code, put up the message box, runtime error number 9, subscript out of range. Do you want to debug or do you want to end? Right? That's what we're telling it to do here. Okay. Question?
Will it continue the code from that point, or will it start over again from the beginning of the subject?
So, oh yeah, so the question is, does this tell it to jump somewhere else? And the answer is no, it doesn't tell it to jump anywhere. It just says, from this point, if any code that happens down here below, that's just going to be normal code. If there's an error, show the error the way it did before we started trying to trap for errors. Okay, so let's actually just go ahead and run this code. So I'm going to run this, I'm going to run my Acme sub runner, and now it should create LIST. Yes, it's created that sheet, lists, no error. That's pretty good. Now I'll go ahead and run it again. It doesn't create another copy of it because this time, let's go ahead and step through it. I'm going to put a breakpoint here. We'll run the code. So F8 should let me step through this. It's trying to bind that on. Is error equal to 9? Nope. Is error equal to 0? Yes, it was. That's why we didn't come down here to the stop. And so we're branching through it. So we're okay. If that sheet doesn't exist, I'll go ahead and delete it. Yes, delete. Run the code again. I haven't stopped it, but it shouldn't give me a syntax error there. Thank you. Else if, hit 5 instead of F5. There we go. Run that. Oh, darn it. I wanted to have my breakpoint. Oh, curse. Delete. Delete. And we'll run again. All right, so this time we're going to try to bind onto a sheet that doesn't exist. F8. If error is number 9, it is. And so we add the sheet, we change the name, and then we're done with the code. Okay, so how do you feel about the idea of an error trap? What we're saying is that we're anticipating some code going bad, some code that might not execute when we try to execute it. If so, tell it how to behave. In this case, just keep right on going, but then we check the condition of the error object to see what error happened, and then we behave accordingly. Anyone saying, I'm utterly befuddled by what, this is like some kind of witchcraft that's happening here? Okay. So now, let's go ahead and kind of do the next part of this of this task, which is to go ahead and build that list. So we've got a particular range here. What am I going to do? Let's think about this, folks. How am I going to narrow this down to just the unique values in this set of data? If you had to do that task by hand, how would you do it? The data tab is a remove duplicates. Yeah, so here's what I'm going to do. This, I'm not familiar enough with this code to just type it out. You can do it along with me, do the recording along with me, and then copy it, or it'll be short enough that you can type it without too much trouble. So you can just watch. So I'm just going to record myself doing that very thing. So macro 1's a great name. I'm just going to take this whole range of data. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to come over here to my list sheet. I'm going to paste it. And then I'm going to, on my data tab, I'm going to come to remove duplicates and remove duplicates. Stop recording. And let's take a look at the code that it generated. Should be in module 2. The whole copying we'll use here in just a minute, but here's the one. We identified a particular range, and from it we have said remove duplicates, columns 1, and headers is yes. So this is the code that we're after here. But we want to do this copying as well. So let's go ahead and kind of begin with the copy to get our data over here. So module 1. So now that we know, let's do this. Let's declare ourselves another value. We want to know which column number on our sheet we're going to be working with. So let me dim something called colnum as an integer. And in here where we're adding it, I'm going to go ahead and say this is a brand new blank worksheet, so the location for this data is going to be column number 1. So colnum equals 1. Now, if the sheet already exists, we better see if we already have a list by that name on the sheet, and if so, replace it. And then we'll have to figure out which column we're in. But for right now, let's just say we're dealing with column number 1. So we've still got some work to do in here, but now we've got column number 1. So here's what I want to do. I've passed in a reference to the column of data that I'm trying to copy. So that's column. So I'm going to say, after my onError go to 0, so after I've kind of finished that error handling, I'm now going to copy that data. I have a reference to that variable column, so it'll just be column, C-O-L-U-M-N, dot copy that column, and I can give it a destination. So that's an optional parameter here. Normally, we copy it and then we paste it. But the copy statement can say you want to you're copying, you probably want to put it somewhere. We need to specify the destination right here. So I'm copying that whole column, and I'm going to paste it into my sheet s.columns number col num. So we're only working so far if we branch through this code here, because otherwise column is going to be 0. There's no column number 0. So this should put the data onto that sheet. And now I'm ready to tell it to do a remove duplicates. So I've got to specify the range. I bet I can just refer that whole column. So the column that I just pasted that into, s.columns colnum, that's where I want to remove the duplicates from. We're expecting there to be a header, and I think this is actually specifying which columns have the duplicates in them. So if I had a multiple column selection that I'm doing, it might want to remove duplicates just based on the first 2 columns. It could be like first name and a last name, and other information about those. You know what? I just want one of those, I don't care which one, but the duplicates are controlled by which columns. That's what I think this is telling us about right here. All right, now I've also passed in a name for this, so let's do this. Let me say that same column, s.columns 1. Now, how can I refer to the very top cell in that column? Here's how I do it. That column has a collection of cells. And the very first one is the top cell in that collection. So I'm saying, look at this whole column, look at cell number 1 in that column, and I'm going to change the value of that to be my list name. So list name is, again, that third parameter that's passed in. Passing the sheet name, the list name, and the column that we're copying the data from. Now then, in this case, creating that sheet, we are then copying the data from the source column, removing duplicates, and then we're putting the list name in the top cell of that newly shrunken down column. Question? Okay, so I'm not quite following. So, not column name, column number, call num. Right. So the question is, what's going on with the column num here? And the answer is the column num is so far in this case we're creating a new worksheet, and then we've got to know which column we're writing the data to. So when we create a new worksheet, it's going to go in the first column. Now, if the sheet already exists, we could have 3 or 4 lists here already, and we're trying to replace an existing list. That's what's going to happen here. If there's no error when we try to bind on to a worksheet by the name that we pass in, that sheet already exists. In that case, we've got to see if the list name exists. If so, that's the column we want to work with. So we haven't built that code yet. So the only thing we're doing with col num right now is we're saying it's going to be 1. We've got to build this code yet, and we've got some more error trapping to do along those lines. Okay, so because for this code to execute, we do have to branch through this, I'm going to go ahead and come back here and delete my worksheet lists so that when I run the code, it will go, oh, there's no sheet there. That's an error. Branch through the code that handles that. And then we'll get to here. So let me go ahead and put my breakpoint back in. In fact, let me just go ahead and put a stop after we get to this point. So stop is just a breakpoint written in code. I'm going to run this code. It should create the sheet and name it. All right, let's just follow through. So I'm going to execute with F8. We're copying and pasting the data there. We're removing duplicates. And then we're putting our list name in there. It happens that the list name was a name that was already there in the header, but if it was different, we would be able to change it. Okay. Questions? Go ahead. So if you're getting a block if without what? So block if without an end if means you've got something started if something, and it's not finding the end if. That could be because you don't have the end if, or you've started some other structure that hasn't been terminated before you got to the end if. So hopefully Parker's going to be able to help him track that down. Okay. So now let's ask, what are we going to do if the sheet already exists? Talk to me in English. What should we do if the sheet already exists? We don't have to create the sheet, but we got to find out the right place to put it. And if the list name doesn't exist here, then we're going to need to say, oh, it should be the very last one. So what if it does exist? What should we do? I think it does exist. We want to replace. We've got some list there. We're saying we're pulling off of our main data store and building the unique set. We just want to replace what's there, if that's the case. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So in this case, we're going to use find. So let's just look across the top row of our newly added sheet and see if we can find the list name in there. If we record ourselves doing this, we get the line, pretty good line of code to paste in here. This is one I've done enough, I can just type it, and it's pretty short, so we'll just go ahead and type it in. So I'm just going to say, I want to look at, now, am I safe just to say S here? Can I just say S dot, what do you think? Am I safe just to assume that S is bound onto a worksheet at this point? Why am I safe to assume that? Yeah, it's because right here we tried to bind S variable onto a worksheet, and error number is 0, which means that line succeeded. So it found the sheet we're bound onto it. That's good. We can just assume that S is there. We don't have to assume, we're confident that it's there. So I'm going to say S dot, now I want to limit my searching just to that top row, that row of headers. So rows number 1 dot find. What am I looking for? I'm looking for my list name. I'm going to put a couple of 3 commas there, and I'm going to tell it to do XL whole. What am I skipping? There's like, do I want to search after some cell? I don't remember what that argument is, but anyway, it's 3 commas and then XL whole. That says do a whole match. I'm matching for the, I don't want to find this in part of some other cell. I want that list name to find it in the whole value of the cell. Now, what this will do is this will return a reference to the cell that it finds. And so I can just say, great. If I have found it there, then all I need to know is what's the column number. So I want it to refer to, yeah, just the column. And all I'm really doing is I am saying my colnum equals that. So I am saying, look at the worksheet, look at that first row, execute the find method. Look for the list name, do a complete match, and if you find that cell, just return the column number of that cell. That's what it's saying. What if it doesn't find the cell? What's this line going to do? This is going to give an error. I didn't find it. Yeah, our on error resume next is still active. And so it's just going to skip it and move on. And so I'll come right here and I will say, actually, let me put a stop right here, because I'm not sure what error number that's going to return. I will want to know what error number it returns. Okay, so I want to make sure that I get this, and so this is only going to be an error if it doesn't find it. So let me change the name of this list here to DDDDD, something that it won't find. So now if I execute this, we're going to say, listen, if there's an error, keep on going. We're going to try to bind S onto the worksheet name. That worksheet name is one we already created a list. It's going to be OK. The error number 0. It's going to try to set the column number equal to the column number where it finds the list name of department. That will fail. And so we won't get any notification of that because we have on error resume next. But we should stop at this point, and then we can kind of look around. We can see what's the value of our error object. So I will run that. And I'll come to my immediate window, and we're just going to look at err.number. It's error number 91. By the way, you can also ask for the description, err.description. Error number 91 is object variable or with blocked variable not set. What is that saying? That is saying we were expecting this to be an identifier of an object. And that does not identify an object. You are trying to call the column method of an object that I don't know what you're talking about. That's error number 91. So now I will come here and say if err.number is equal to 91, then we'll do something else if error.number equals 0, else, and then end if. We're not quite showing all of it. Error number 0 means there has been no error. So by the time I get to this line, before I execute this line, I know error number is 0 because I got into this part of the if statement because error number was 0. Everything's working fine. Error number 0 means everything is okay. We execute this line. If it's error number 91, what does this mean? This means list name was not found. This means list name was found. This means something else went wrong. Something else went wrong. I'm just going to put a stop right here. I am not anticipating that error ever happening. The only thing I'm anticipating happening is we'll either find that or it won't find it. And so I'm just not expecting it. Okay. So if it doesn't find it, what shall we do? We have our sheet of all of our lists that we're building here. It found that okay, but the list we're trying to build doesn't exist on this sheet of lists yet. So where shall we put it? We got to do something. We got to put it here somewhere. Where we're going to put it? Yep. Oh, that's pretty good. We could just insert a column in column 1 and dump it right there. I actually like that better than what I was going to show you. But what I'm going to show you will be helpful for the midterm. So let me show you my way. But give yourself a pat on the back. I think that's actually a better solution than what I'm about to do. Question here? He said just insert a column, and then you know it's going to be column 1. That's where you're going to put it. And make a blank column, and you can dump it right there. It's a good answer. I like that answer a lot. Yeah, we just want to find where the last column is. And so that's the approach that I'm going to do. So if the list name wasn't found, great. All we need to do is set the column number. Here, we're trying to set the column number equal to where it found it. If this line fails, this assignment doesn't happen. And so we're going to find that new one. So col num equals s dot cells. Okay, I'm identify a particular cell. I'm going to look all the way over at the very last column, and then I'm going to shoot back until I bump into some data. So what row do I want? Row number 1. Column number s dot columns dot count. There's like 64,000 of them, or 16,000 of them. Columns dot count. By the way, if I just ask for columns.count, it will just tell me a number, tell me how many columns there are. If I haven't told it which sheet, it's going to assume the active sheet. 16,000, 16,384. That's how many columns there are. So this expression right here is referring to which column, which cell. Which cell is that expression I have highlighted referring to? Yeah, row number 1, and whatever the very last column is, that's the cell we're talking about. So that identifies that particular cell. From there, I just want to do an end. Nope. s.columns.count. Thank you. End XL to left. That's going to come back until it bumps into some data. That should be my last data cell there. I want to know the column of that cell, and I want to add one onto it. Whew. I already have a data sheet, but I can't find this list here anywhere. Go all the way in, come back till I find some data, go one over. That's the number that's the number of the column I'm trying to push data into. Okay? All right. Actually, if the error number is 0, I think we're probably okay. We don't need anything else here. So I think that's it. Is that it? Yeah. Because what we're trying to, so now we have a column number in 3 conditions. 1, if we build a brand new sheet, we know it's column number 1. If the sheet already exists and the column already exists, we'll read the column number here. If the sheet already exists and the column number doesn't exist, we'll read it here. So now we've got at this point, we know we've got a sheet, we know we've got a column number, we should be in good shape. I'm going to get rid of this stop my code. I should have two stops in my code now. Yeah, and they're both here in this clause, my error handling if something else that was unanticipated happened. I think that's going to do it. Let's go ahead and run the code again. And so it should find this sheet. It won't find department, so it should give me another column right here in column B with department, with my departments in it. And, oh, I had one other comment here, so let me comment that one out, and we'll run from there. So it looks like it has built that column, department here. Let me go ahead and add some other data in here. If I run this again, I'm expecting it to find that and replace the data in column B with the list that we're generating here. So I'll run this again. Yeah, and you kind of saw it flash the data in there and then collapse it down. It just replaces that data and puts it as we asked. We can give it a different name besides department. We can just call it dept. And now this should make another one called dept. It should put it right here. I was a little bit surprised to see this change. Didn't that used to say something different? Oh, the comment was, I ran it from where it was and it filled over the top. So let me go ahead and run this. We're now looking for one called dept. Yeah, and so, oh, but it looks like it's putting it in column number 1 no matter what. That's what's happening here. So we got to make sure that column heading is going in the right place. S.columns not 1. That's not the right column. What column should be putting the list name onto? Yeah, whatever column is, the column I'm working on. Control minus. So now if I run it with dept, it should put that in column C and call it dept. So we're feeling pretty good here. This is a little bit complex of error handling. So we're setting ourselves up with one on error resume next, and we're actually anticipating two different problems. One, assuming that the sheet exists, and it might not, so we're checking to see if there's an error. But if it did exist, we're assuming that the header exists, and if it doesn't, we're checking to see what error happened. We could use different code to, instead of just trying it and then trapping to see if it happens, we could write the code that says, let's check and see if the sheet exists. By the way, would that always be preferable? What do you think? Is it better just to try it and trap for it? Or is it better to iterate across all of them and find out if it exists, and then move on, have your code branch depending on whether it exists or not? What do you think? Which one's preferable? Go ahead.
I feel like it's putting the fence at the top before putting an ambulance at the bottom of the to check to see if it exists prior to.
Yeah, so here you're saying you're making a problem, you're letting a problem happen, then fixing the problem. And you say you think it's probably better to say, you know what, let's just don't let the problem happen in the first place. Let's just write the code so we can figure out how it's supposed to behave without responding to the error. So generally I would say you're right. Let me give you two exceptions. There are some times when you can't check before it happens. There's just whatever environment is, there's nothing to check. It's a runtime error and you have to respond to it. But there's another case here as well. Let's suppose that we had, I don't even know how many tabs you can have, but it could be something that were to loop through them, it takes a long time to look through it. In which case, and if you have to do it over and over again, it might really be substantially faster just to try it and to respond to the failure. So I don't think you can have more than 255 worksheets in a workbook. So how long does it take to go across 255 values and check to see if there's a match? Millisecond or two. I mean, it's really short. But if it was tens of thousands of things that you had to check, then you might say, you know what, this might be better just to try it, let it fail, and then move on. Question here in the back? Oh, that's a good question. The question here, isn't it looking through, I mean, isn't that what's happening? Could this really be faster? And the answer is probably not. So Excel has, so what we're setting up is a linear search. And although I don't know specifically about how Excel maintains what the names of the worksheets are, it might have a much more sophisticated structure to find that much quicker than a linear search. So if it's keeping a list of those cells, of those sheet names sorted somewhere, then it can find it much quicker than looking at every single one. Right? It could just, the whole idea of if you've got a sorted list, you can jump right to the middle of it and say, is the value I'm looking for above or below it? And if it's below, you've just thrown away half the list. With each read, you throw away half of your remaining values. And so if it's a long list, you can get through dramatically faster than a linear search. Generally speaking, Excel does things better than a linear search almost always when it's happening internally. Yeah, it's a good question though. Okay, so that's error trapping. Let me show you just really quickly the other kind of error handler that the book is going to talk to you about. And I'll expect you to have some familiarity with this for the midterm starting later this week. Sub ERR R2 on error, go to, and then I'm going to give it a label. I'm going to call it error handler. ERR HANDLER. Ooh. I'll then have some code that I want to put in here. Dim x as an integer, x equals 5 divided by 0. That should give me an error. Now I'm going to put an error handler. Here's the way I set up. I'm telling this to go somewhere. Go to my error handler. This is a reference to a label. I have to have a label. We don't have line numbers anymore. We want to branch to a particular part of the code. We do it with a label. ERRHANDLER. Error handler colon. Message box and error happened. Actually, we'll put that at the top and we'll put the description inside the message box. ERR dot description, comma, VB critical, comma, and error happened. So this will be a message box that shows up. It'll say an error happened at the top. It'll have an X and make some kind of critical sound, and it will give the description of the error. But the point is, it's not the built-in error handler. This is an error handler that I have written for it. So if I run this, I'm setting up my error handler. I'm not saying resume next. I'm saying if there's an error, branch down to some other place where I've got some code to deal with the error. I might have something here that sends an email to me. I didn't expect to get here, but someone made my code go here. I want to know about it. And it might have some information in it and can just send me that message. So now let me run this code. An error happened, division by 0. Here's the problem. Let's suppose it's not division by 0. X equals 5 divided by 1. That should be okay. What's going to happen? I run this, and I still get the dialog box, an error happened. What description do I have here? Yeah, there's no description. Why? There's no error. Well, why am I showing the dialog box? Yeah, it's just executing this code. Declare this variable, do this, label, very interesting. It got here. And so I've got to tell this subprocedure something. If you get to here, you're really done. How do I tell it just to quit the subprocedure here? Exit sub. So now the only way to get here is if I branch to it, right? If I jump to it. And the only way I've set up to jump to it is if there's an error. So now all the code I have here at the bottom is I'll only get to it if I've gotten to an error. So instead of putting my little error trap, just building it right around this little code, I'm saying if there's an error, just jump down here, and I've got some general error handling code. So typically, when I'm taking this approach, it's to fail gracefully. It's to put up a message to the user, something really unexpected happened, give Professor Allen a call, here's his email address. By the way, we've already sent a message to him, and he'll probably ignore it until you call him, so here's a telephone number, give him a call. So that's kind of the two things. I'm not quite sure what happened, just branch down here and have something to gracefully exit, or I'm really anticipating an error. Let me build a trap around it. Okay, we spent all the class on runtime errors. We still got to get to debugging. Go ahead. So the question is, could there be a situation where, well, the error happened, I'd like to record it, and then just kind of keep on going where it came from? And the answer is yes, it's really rare, and we can make this code do that. Let's not spend our time on that. Yeah, we can tell it just, we've done this part now, go right back to where it was, and pick up with the next line after the error and continue. If you really want to see that, let's talk after class. These are the ones I'll expect you to be familiar with. On error, resume next, and then build the error trap around there, or on error, go to some branched code, and then kind of have a general procedure for exiting gracefully. Okay, second content for today is what are our tools about debugging? The debugging tools, we've used them kind of already without talking about them explicitly. The whole idea is to get ourselves into break mode, which I've been doing with the stop statement. Stop just says, hey, when you get to this point in the code, suspend, leave everything in memory, and that gives me the opportunity to kind of come and explore it in the immediate window. So if I can put a stop there, or I can just put a temporary breakpoint without writing in the code by clicking in the margin here and getting a red line. Now if this runs, I'll enter break mode at that point when I hit the breakpoint, and now I can come up here to the immediate window, and I can say, hey, what's X? And it'll tell me. Because it's loaded in memory, I can ask those questions. I can't ask what X is unless X has been declared and is sitting in memory. And when I run that sub procedure, at the very beginning of the sub procedure, it allocates all the memory, and then it starts putting values in it, but as soon as it gets to the end sub at the end, it dumps everything out of memory. And so I've got to have some way to say, between when the variable gets declared and when it gets released, pause so I can look at it. That's what going into break mode means. Stop is the statement that takes you there. You can set the breakpoint here. There's other ways to set breakpoints. Let's talk about a couple of them real quick. Well, actually, probably more important is to look at this. There's a tool I don't use in class. I think we've talked about it once before. It's because it's too tiny to see. I'm going to come to my locals window. The locals window just gives you a window that shows all of your variables and what their current value is. So right now it's 5. If I stop this code, that'll go out of scope, so it's no longer declared. And let me go ahead and run it again. I'll put a breakpoint here before I execute that line. And so now, if you really want to see it, go get the video and zoom in on it, but it really is a 0 there. It says X is 0. And as I execute this line, just by stepping into, I'll press F8. It executes that line. It has changed this now to 5. So I don't have to go type in the immediate window to say, hey, what's X? It just shows me all of my variables there. So that locals window can be really, really handy. Now, the locals window will show you those variables, but there's another thing similar called a watch expression. Let me go ahead and build a watch expression. This will be the last thing that we cover for today. So a watch expression, we can do it like the locals window. I'm just going to highlight this. I'll right-click it and say add watch. And it's going to say, here's your expression, X. I'll say OK, and now it's going to show up a watch window. And so now it's showing my watch expression X, telling me it's out of context, but this now will behave just like the other one does as well. I can just always see what X is. But the whole reason that a watch expression is interesting is because it can be more complex than just a variable. And so I can come and add a different watch expression. Just go ahead and right-click, add watch. And I can make this any expression that I want to. I can put in here, X equals 2. That's now going to be another expression for me to watch. And as I'm running, it's either going to be true or false. So for X, right now, X is 5. Its value is 5. The expression X equals true is false. So watches can be more complex than just a single variable. And there's one more thing that I can do with that watch window that's really powerful. And that is, let me go ahead and take this breakpoint off. I'm going to add another watch expression. Add watch. And my expression is going to be X is greater than 0. And instead of making this a watch expression, I'm going to make it a conditional breakpoint. I'm going to say enter break when this value is true. So when x is greater than 0, when that is true, it's going to go, stop. This condition just got met. Take me into break mode. I don't have the word stop written. I don't have a breakpoint checked. This is what's called a conditional breakpoint. It will break as soon as some condition is met in the code. So now, although I have no breakpoints here, when I run this, it's going to enter break mode right here. Why did it enter break mode here? It's the next line after the line that changed that conditional breakpoint to be true. So this line has to execute, and then it goes, I just did that. Oh my gosh, my conditional breakpoint is now true. Stop. And it stops at the next line, the next possible line of code. So those are your main debugging tools. I'm guessing you've already had some experience with them, stepping through code and setting breakpoints. There's a couple other tools there. Questions? All right, I will email tomorrow morning once I get confirmation on location for our review session, which will be at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening. Thanks for coming. Class dismissed.